really appreciate the opportunity to share with you something that has been on my mind for this past year. My thesis is that overpopulation and overconsumption are the two primary drivers of the climate crisis. Now, in 1995, when I retired from being a professional beggar with KWIT, I took over a small organization called Alternatives for Simple Living, which continues to this day as Simple Living Works. At that time, our focus was almost entirely on overconsumption. You know, our lavish lifestyles, especially in North America and in Western Europe. For example, at that time, we were using 10 times as many resources and producing 10 times as much waste as a person in Mexico. At that time, we were using 30 times as much resources as a person in India. That was in 1995. Well, in the process, of course, we've had some population experiments around the globe. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them. The most well-known is the China experiment. About 20 years ago, they instituted the one-child policy. And as despicable as that was to our Western sentiments, that has worked for China. And what they did, of course, is that each family got one child, and all the others were aborted. Now, the family got to decide the sex of that child. So if it was a girl child, it very likely got aborted. If it was a boy child, then it was born. Now, why did that work for China? For one thing, it gave them a bigger male workforce. And secondly, it gave them a lot fewer wombs to produce more children in the future. So, about 5 years ago, the growth rate in China had stabilized. Remember, you have to distinguish between growth rate and gross population, because their gross population is still enormous, still number largest in the world. So, they instituted the two-child policy. So now a family can have 2 children. Of course, there's also, that's what we call top-down control. And that only works when you live in a top-down kind of country. Now, a positive example comes out of Thailand. About 20 years ago, Thailand instituted an intensive program of adult education. And it worked so well. They had people, their birth rate, their family size went from 6 children to 2 children in 20 years. Because they got rid of the stigma of contraception, for one thing. So there's a really positive example of a bottom-up, changing people's minds. It wasn't coercive. Now, currently, India, for example, is using coercive techniques. Forced sterilization. Not working so well for them. And both in China and India, of course, their standard of living is going up, so their rate of consumption is going up. But in India, they are on track to become the most populous country in the world in 20 years. So that's another example. Top down, not working. The committee that asked me to speak also about Israel and Palestine. Now, this is going to be a little longer section, but in the end, it's about population also. So, I'm going to give you a caricature of history, please. And that is, as you might remember, in 1948, the year I was born, the Allies decided, because the Jews had been slaughtered by the Nazis, to bring them back to the Holy Land, to bring them back to their homeland in Israel. And so, the trouble is, of course, that Israel was populated by the Palestinians. And so, there was a lot of conflict, and it remains to this day. And what's happened, and I want to make an important distinction here, because what I'm going to say is not anti-Semitic. I love my Jewish brothers and sisters, but we have to distinguish between the nation of Israel and the rogue state of Israel. The nation of Israel is Jews, the diaspora, Jews all around the world. But the state of Israel, as we read in the news, has been criticized by the United Nations time and time again for its genocide against the Palestinian people. Now, what's happening is that you have the really conservative fundamentalist Jews that are having lots of kids. And why are they doing that? Well, partly because more kids means more land. Then they can get more settlements. And these settlements, of course, are being pushed into Palestinian land. They're stealing more of the Palestinian land so they can have more settlements. Now, in contrast, the fundamentalist Islamic people, and the Palestinians are primarily Islamic, there are some Palestinian Christians. The fundamentalist Islamic people are having kids too. Again, for political reasons, because they think that by having more kids, they'll somehow get more land. Not working so well for them right now. Because in what's happening is more kids means more suffering. So that's just an example, what I consider to be a negative example of how population is used in a political way. Now, there's a really wicked turn to this whole story, because the folks who are trying to take over more Palestinian lands are called Zionists. And of course, there are lots of flavors of Jews. We have lots of peace-loving Jews in Israel. And we have the Zionists who want to take over more land. We also have, in this country, Christian Zionists. And Christian Zionists support Israel taking over more and more land. Now here's where it gets really wicked. Christian fundamentalists believe that when Israel takes over Jerusalem and returns to the Holy Land, the end times will come. Jesus is going to come back, and we'll have Armageddon and the end of time. And the Jews will go to hell. You see how wicked that is? It would be funny, yes, it would be funny if it wasn't so sad. Yes. So, just want to make sure that we have the picture there. I mean, you asked for this, so. And another, in my mind, wicked part of this is the United States is committed to giving the rogue state of Israel $30 billion over a period of 10 years in foreign aid, mostly military. Let's switch to another example. This is in Africa. In Africa, right now, the continent of Africa produces about 25% of all new births. But in 2050, at the current rate of birth rates around the globe, in 2050, Africa will be producing 50% of all new births. Well, this topic is really hard for people in the United States to talk about. We have a real strong media bias against talking about overpopulation. And I'd like to give you just an example. I'm not picking on anybody in particular. I think it has primarily to do with the commercial sponsors of our media that don't want us to talk about overpopulation. Because in order for our economy to continue to grow, which it can't, but they want it to continue growing because as it grows, they make bigger profits. In order for it to grow, there have to be more customers. So in order to have more customers, you need to have continual growth in population. I want to give you this example. I love PBS, don't get me wrong, but when Judy Woodruff was interviewing Bill and Melinda Gates the other day, the headline was Overpopulation in Africa. And in the extended interview, they talked a great deal about what the Gates were doing to help people in Africa. Never once did they talk about overpopulation or what they were doing to limit population growth in Africa. For me, that is media bias. Okay, now we're going to talk about the future. So, enough for all. This is my crop walk shirt. Appropriate for the time, don't you think? I'm going to read to you from an essay I wrote for my church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Don't be fooled, we're the progressive Lutherans. Don't be fooled by the word evangelical, okay? Global human population now exceeds 7 billion. By 2100, at the current growth rate, it is expected to exceed 9 billion. Optimally, the Earth can perpetually sustain 1.5 to 2 billion humans. The optimal human population has been estimated by Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb. He's still active, by the way, at Stanford. And this estimate includes optimal population means decent wealth and resources for everybody, basic human rights for everyone, preservation of cultural diversity, allowance of intellectual, artistic, and technological creativity, and preservation of biodiversity. Based on this, the optimal population is 1.5 to 2 billion. Now, population reduction will eventually happen involuntarily, whether we want it to or not, unless we take action now. Billions, especially the poor, will suffer and die when the environment implodes. It is immoral to put more children at risk. The earth will regenerate with a small number of humans or no humans at all. Humans are not clever enough to solve the problems caused by overpopulation and overconsumption while still maintaining overpopulation and overconsumption. Only reducing population and consumption can begin to solve these problems, most notably what I call the creation crisis, which we call euphemistically global warming. In an email with Daniel Rift, who's the director of the ELCA World Hunger and Disaster Relief, I was informed that the program is not directly involved in limiting population. He said, and I quote, "We are tending to talk more specifically about reproductive health, that is, child spacing, maternal and child health, and disease prevention," close quote. This is really valuable, but in my opinion, is completely inadequate. We need to work on the root causes of the creation crisis, and although the Lutherans, especially in the US and Western Europe, have proven themselves responsible by small families in the 20th century, at the same time, we feed and care for people who have more children than they can provide for. We will continue to provide both emergency aid and long-term education for hunger relief and health care. At the same time, we need to share with peoples around the globe the need for smaller families, such as stop at 2. Now, we can promote prevention of overpopulation in numerous non-coercive ways. We can provide free, voluntary contraception for men, women, and others, both short-term, such as condoms and birth control pills, and long-term, such as contraceptive injections and patches, and even voluntary sterilization. We can support agencies that provide reproductive health care for women, men, and others, such as Planned Parenthood, both in principle and with actual dollars. We can also disclose fake pregnancy counseling agencies that do not present people with all their options. And we have plenty of those fake agencies in Sioux City. We can educate through traditional classes and one-on-one counseling, and also some new creative mass media. And I'll be telling you about those in just a minute. They're really, really interesting. We can help break down the myths that drive overpopulation, such as that God created women to have babies, that a woman's worth is determined by the size of her family, myths that are perpetuated by the misreadings of the Elder Testament, and by the complementarity movement among religious fundamentalists. I won't go into that now, but if you want to discuss complementarity sometime, I can. Also, in the developing age of robotics, artificial intelligence, and medical advances, we'll need fewer humans to meet life's daily needs, unlike the age when muscle power was central for manufacturing and agriculture. This essay is not about eugenics, not about racial superiority or forced sterilization. It doesn't suggest that for the sake of the health of living species, but it does suggest that for our health, some cultural, traditional practices may have to change, including large families. Maintaining ethnic diversity is essential to the welfare of the whole system, as is biodiversity. There are many possible coercive ways to limit population growth, such as eliminating tax deductions for every child past number 2, or requiring each potential parent to secure a permit before having a child. This essay does not suggest any of these negative means. So that was a little discussion about the future. So now I want to talk a little bit about the alternatives, what we can do. You'll be interested to know that despite Catholic Church policy, over half of Catholic families use contraception. And Pope Francis has come out publicly for smaller families. This is my free speech TV, alternative media shirt. Another, of course, alternatives I've already mentioned would be pro-choice organizations like Planned Parenthood. I have to tell you I hope you'll find this humorous. We have a large church, Catholic church, where we live, that a couple times a year puts up lots of crosses in their courtyard with a big sign that says, "Pray to end abortion." Okay, almost done. It says pray to end abortion, okay? And that's their right to speak out. So there's a vacant lot across the street, and I wanted to put up a big sign that says, pray to end overpopulation. We'll see. As you know, right now in the United States, we have some really unfortunate policies. The Trump administration gag rule is just insidious. The federal money cannot be used with any health agencies that include counseling or even suggesting abortion. But it goes beyond that. Any foreign aid will not go to any country that even mentions abortion as an option. So, a couple of organizations I'd like to recommend to you. One is called Zero Population Growth, which was started by Paul Ehrlich, is now called Population Connection. And I had a chance to interview the head of Population Connection on my podcast. If you want to hear him, what he has to say, that would be a good idea. But be aware of fake population control organizations, because there are some around. One is called Negative Population Growth. It's an anti-immigrant organization. That's its prime theme, is to keep Mexicans out of our country. But they call themselves negative population because they want to keep people out. But one I would strongly recommend is called World Balance. They produce a podcast called, rightly, Overpopulation. And I just happen to have their bumper sticker. Here it says, solve overpopulation. One-child families can save humanity. WorldPopulationBalance.org. Another one I'd recommend, their goal, by the way, by 2100 is 3 billion people without suffering. And focus is primarily on education. Another organization is called the Population Institute, and its colleague organization is called Population Media Center. I just find this fascinating. What they do is they work with countries, primarily in Africa, to produce soap operas. Because the women and men in Africa will watch soap operas. They may not go to a lecture about population, but in these soap operas, they present women, strong women, who limit the size of their families. And it's being quite successful. Their goal is to change these myths that somehow that they have to have a large family. I mean, for example, right now in one African country, they took a survey, they do surveys, they found that a man thinks that the ideal family is 14 children. And they asked the women thought 11 children was sufficient. So they're in the process with these soap operas of changing these myths, that somehow your value is based on the size of your family. And I have to tell you about this one just adorable little example I saw on a documentary. These documentaries primarily do not come from US sources, they come primarily from outside the US. Picture this, 5-year-old little African children learning their ABCs. So, A is for abstinence. Now this was to help prevent AIDS, understand. Primary goal wasn't overpopulation, it was to prevent AIDS. A is for abstinence. B is for birth control. And C is for condomization. And these adorable little 5-year-old children were singing their alphabet, their ABCs, learning birth control at the same time. It was adorable. Another organization I want to mention is called Growth Busters. Not Ghostbusters, Growth Busters. And they try to help to eliminate growth, economic growth, as well as growth in population. Because you can't have continuous economic growth on a finite planet. And they're very effective in presenting that case. Another one is called CASE, C-A-S-S-E, counsel to advance a steady state economy. Steady state versus growth economy. Then we have the wonderful example of Bhutan. Little country, Himalayan country, they've done away with the gross national product. Of course, we get all excited about, the stock market and the gross national product. Bhutan says, no. What's important is the gross happiness index. The most important thing is the happiness of their people. And they were able to get the United Nations to pass a resolution on the same idea. What's important is gross happiness. So, if you'll bear with me, one last personal story. Rita and I are both Danish, and so we're Danish Americans. If you have a grandparent who's bragging about having 14 grandchildren, don't criticize them, but don't applaud them. It ain't wonderful to have 14 grandchildren. So, finally, I would encourage you to vote for pro-choice, anti-corporatist candidates, if we can find any. And as a little commercial, if you want to receive information from me, I produce a little brief daily nudge for simple living. Everything is on the internet, by email, Twitter, or if you want to get my weekly nudge, or my twice a month podcasts, all I need is your name and your email address, and I'll be glad to share that with you. We just went over our 115th episode. So I really appreciate this chance to sound off. And I'll be glad to talk to you individually downstairs afterwards. Thank you.